Hello. Welcome, everybody. My name is Tim Wise. I'm the Research and Policy Director at the Global Development and Environment Institute, right down on TLAB. If you haven't found us yet. We're the sponsors of this event, and we're very, very excited to have Frances Moore Lappé. One of the very well-hidden treasures of our local area. I hadn't even realized until a couple of years ago that she was hiding right in our backyard. So now you'll know that she's a local resource too. She says this is only the second time she's spoken at Tufts, which I find shocking and almost embarrassing. So we'll have to pick up our game a little bit here. Before I introduce Frankie, I want to say something about this event, which is being webcast or in webinar format. So there are some people listening and watching online. Welcome them. They will participate at the end by questions. If those of you who are listening out there, if you unmute or whatever you're on, when you ask your question. I should make one other announcement, which is that this Thursday, right? GDAE is sponsoring another event. Flyers right up here. It's on climate economics with several notable Tufts experts on the topic. Time is 1:30 to 2:45 in Sophia Gordon Hall. So don't miss that. So I've known Frankie for a while now, but I've known her books. I actually looked at the bookshelf, and that's what I have. Food First, which is maybe bestseller of all. Diet for a Small Planet is the biggest winner. I read that. Somebody stole my Diet for a Small Planet, probably my daughter. World Hunger, 12 Myths. This was edition 2. Is what we're going to hear about today, and 8 is Obstacle. That was, those were the 3 that were right front and center on my shelf if I'd included the ones from her co-author of the current book that she's talking about, World Hunger and Myths, is Joe Collins. I have 3 more books up here. Frankie is, as that indicates, a prolific author who has been writing now for almost 50 years on the topic of hunger and myth of scarcity. This book that she'll be speaking about today is an entirely new version of World Hunger, 12 Myths. They were asked to do a new edition, and they decided to do it completely right. So it's a very fresh new look that not only dispenses with 2 myths, I don't going from 12 to 10, but goes into the on the 10 that are there. It's a wonderful read. We'll have someone from the bookstore here selling books at the end of the event, and I'm guessing you could get Frankie to sign them. She's going to have to sign mine and all my old books too. So, Frankie now works at the Small Planet Institute, which is tucked away in Harvard Square in Cambridge. She has many incarnations and is always in the process of reinventing herself. And her next reinvention is working on what she calls living democracy. I'm sure in the question and answer period, if you ask her about it, she'd be happy to tell you something about that. But for now, let me just say, sit back, enjoy. Your cell phones off, please, and let me present Frances Moore Lappé.
And as soon as I give one update to people online, you can mute yourself during the presentation that you sent up. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. It's been a long road, as some of you know, complex book. And I first want to just acknowledge Rachel Gilbert. Rachel, where are you? Hi. Rachel made a huge contribution to the research for this book, and I so appreciate you. And I also want to shout out for Emmy Fugabeals, who spent time and you will see some of your footprints here, I'm sure, right here. So, at Small Planet as well. So it's so wonderful to see many people who I adore here. So, okay, here we are, all these years. Now, this slide is from the journey that I took with my daughter to write the book, Hope's Edge. And this is our takeaway from that journey. This is what we learned. And actually, this photograph was taken just after we both realized that I had the Sanskrit word for food is Anna, so I named my daughter Food. And she was then traveling with me to write this book about food. So that's where I began this photograph, because it always takes me to my core approach to life. No better way to state it than D. Hock, who was the founder of Visa of all things. And he says, it is far too late and things are far too bad for pessimism. And that is kind of the theme song of my life and this book in a way. And so I want to begin with a couple of questions to you, but let me just give you a little bit of orientation. Well, let me just start with a question. How many of you are extremely worried about the state of our planet? I don't see any hands that are down, actually. I think this is maybe there was on this one. Okay, but there's a second question I want to ask. How many of you believe that you have a general hypothesis of a causal theory, a theory of causation about how we got into this downward spiral? Well, there's a big difference there, and here's why I ask it, is that I believe that it's absolutely essential for us to have a working hypothesis for this reason. I believe that one can prove that solutions to just about every great problem that we're facing are known. So what really matters is whether we can manifest those known solutions. And what keeps us from that is a feeling of powerlessness. So I start with the premise that without a working theory of how we got into this mess, then we won't feel our power. We won't realize our power to reverse that causal cycle. So I would love to know, those of you who raised your hands, what your theories are, but see, I have the mic. And so my talk today is organized around laying out for you, with this theme of hunger, laying out for you what my hypothesis is, what my working theory is that gives me a sense of direction. And so to begin that, I have to begin where I began in the late 60s. I began as a very directionless young woman in one sense. I was a community organizer, but was really struggling. How can I make sense of the world? And I had this great intuition that food would be the thread through which I could untangle this dotted yarn knot of economics and politics. Everybody was interested in food. Everybody had to eat. We could quantify it. So if I could just understand why hunger, that would unlock the mysteries, I would find my direction. And of course, then we were reading The Population Bomb Exploded. A book entitled Famine 1975 came out, and every headline about food was about scarcity. There just wasn't enough in famine. So there I was, and trying to figure it out. And of course, still today, what is so often the description of the reality situation today is still scarcity is the new norm, because it's distinguished analyst Mr. Brown. So in some ways, I still have to begin the book and this talk with just fixing our minds on what is the reality of food supply in the world today. So I just start with right in the beginning that, in fact, The reality is quite different. Scarcity, really? Come on already. 2,900 calories, that's more than most, even really active American males are recommended. That's way more than most of us without gaining a lot of weight. That's for every person, every day on our earth, what's produced. And since I wrote Diet for a Small Planet, the food supply is actually, per person, has increased about 40%. Comes to 3 or 4 pounds of food each day. So that is really the challenge here is to understand how can that be. And please note that this is what I like to say is only on the leftovers. This amount of food is after we have fed about half of all grain goes either to feed for livestock or increasingly for fuel or other industrial purposes. And 3/4 of all agricultural land is used to produce livestock that return to us about 17% are calories. And of course, many of you know this, that's 1/3, UN estimate, 1/3 of all of our food waste. In writing this book, one of the most, it's still surprising that, I think I understand this, but I'm still so surprised to learn that because the U.S. has such a meat-centric diet, in large part, that actually this is another measure of the extreme inefficiency of the big drum, that actually the U.S. feeds fewer people per acre than does Indian or Chinese agriculture. That's another way of looking at the extreme inefficiency and waste in the system. So people ask me with the new book, have things gotten better, Frankie, or worse? And I answer with a cliche, both. And I want to talk about both afternoon. So on one hand, we've heard a lot of people celebrating this year that the UN's, the measure of hunger that the only one most anyone ever hears, 800 million people, has fallen so greatly that we have virtually met the Millennial Development Goal of cutting by half the share of hungry people in the Global South who are hungry. And it sounds like a great success. Well, I wanted to say a couple of things to alert us to the limits of this measure as we get into the extent of hunger, and that is that we know that it is only about calories, and to register in this 800 million count, that you have to be hungry for more than a year. And it means that some unknown amount, but significant, no doubt, people who are hungry between harvests, the lean season, aren't calculated into that, aren't counted, quote unquote counted, because it's not really a count, but aren't captured in this measure. Because what they do is average the calories over the year. So you could be very hungry for 3 months and have tremendously negative consequences for your health without being captured in that 800 million number. The other thing that we point out, of course, that I feel pretty strongly about is that when we think about reducing suffering, it should really be the number of hungry people, not the proportion in the population. Because if I tell you that you are a smaller share of, you're hungry, but you're a smaller share of a whole, you're not going to feel a whole lot better. And so I think we need to focus very much on how have we reduced the number of hungry people. And if you take that measure, it comes to a much more modest change since 1990. We've reduced the number about 20%, not almost half. And if we remove China's progress from that total, if we remove China's progress, it's about a 6% reduction in the number. So that's one way of getting an understanding of this measure of calorie deficiency. But something else is, I know that many of you are aware, maybe all of us are aware that actually calories and nutrition are parting ways. Increasingly in the world, that one can get enough calories and yet be nutrient deficient. And it struck me so much when I was talking to an Indian doctor who has been treating 2,000 patients each month, 2,000 patients, and he said, that, even a decade, 15, 20 years ago, that, the problem was calorie deficiency, but now he said that people, almost all of his poor patients get enough calories. 60% of them are diabetic or have heart conditions. So it just brought home this reality that, as the Lancet article we cite in the book says, that in most regions of the world, including the poorest regions, that the quality of diets are diminishing. So we don't really have a global measure of the extent of nutrient, what we call nutritional deprivation. So what we've done in the new book is to suggest that because we're lacking a measure that really is a complex measure that includes calories and nutrients, we'll look at what we do have, and we have this 800 million calorie deficient. We also know that children under 5 are measured, we also know that children under 5 get, when it's general, that extrapolated from those studies of children who are stunted, that roughly 1/4 of the world's children have been deemed stunted, which we know is not just being short. It actually has lifelong health consequences. And we know from the WHO that 2 billion of us are deficient in at least one nutrient, and that is no small matter. That iron deficiency alone is linked to about 1/5 of all maternal deaths. So we say that the best we can do now is to acknowledge that roughly 1/4 of humanity is suffering the consequences of nutritional deprivation, not being able to get either the calories or the nutrients they need. And we can talk about that more, but that to us is a much more realistic estimate, despite, remember, all that abundance that we registered in the beginning of the slide. So here we are. And so I'm suggesting then that we are still not able, we're not grappling with this reality of hunger amidst plenty that has been the focus of my last work. But I want to look at another piece of the challenge. That another piece that I could not have foreseen when I wrote Diet for a Small Planet is the way that our food systems are highly dependent on manufactured inputs, especially, and forest destruction is a major contributor to climate change. This chapter on climate change probably took more than any other, and we've taken this estimate that as much as 29% of all greenhouse gas emissions can be linked to our food system. So that is another piece of the challenge that we have to, as we later in my talk when I move to solutions, that we will have to grapple with as we move to solutions. I'll just tell you another couple of things that really struck me as I looked at the food system now versus when I began, is that I couldn't have foreseen, for example, to the extent to which we have disrupted the nutrient cycle for key nutrients that we need to build food. And the experts that I turned to on the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, they said to me that we have more radically disrupted the nutrient cycle in soil than we have the carbon cycle in the atmosphere, to our great detriment. And they pointed out that the absolute dead end to it, that we cannot continue this, and particularly many of you know about the dead end that phosphorus fertilizers represent, that 75% of all known reserves are in area in Sahara, northern Sahara, that in Morocco and Western Sahara, that will be gone in certainly within a generation or two. There's a lot of different estimates on when it will be gone, but it is not a viable pathway for relying on manufactured fertilizers. So that sense of the hitting the dead end came through to me in a much more vivid way. And soil itself, in fact, our team at Small Planet talked about, oh, sorry, I forgot that. I'd added that slide about climate change that many of you have seen that study, I'm sure, that the UNFAO estimates that if food waste were a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. So that's another piece of the climate challenge that food represents to us today. And I realized that I want to go back then to this slide about what I was so struck by is that our food system is eroding soil at somewhere between 13 and 40 times faster than nature can build soil. And just imagine this, that the loss every year is equivalent to 4 pickup trucks worth of topsoil for every single person on Earth, just to give you a sense of the magnitude of what cannot continue and are still being able to feed ourselves. So that is something of the dramatic picture that I try to capture in this new book. And so all of this and more is what has led me to the real guiding question of my life. And this is it. Why are we together creating a world that not one of us as individuals would choose? Because none of what I've just told you would anyone on this earth get up and say, yes, yes, another child dying of hunger. Yes, yes, let's heat the planet and ruin our croplands and soil erosion. That's not what any individual wants, but it's what we together are doing. And so I've struggled and been led by many great thinkers to ask, what is it that is unique about our species that could help us understand why are we creating together a world that none of us as individuals want? So I believe that we've learned that we are creatures of the mind. We see the world not as it is, but as we are. Einstein said it is theory which I'm going to get exactly right, decides. Theory which decides what we can observe. And so what theory are we looking through? In other words, I'm saying that we often okay. Here's a homey story. You already know the punchline, but forget that image. Here's a homey story that captures this idea that we see what we expect to see and not what we don't expect to see. It's Thanksgiving, and I'm at home, and I have 35 people coming for dinner in the afternoon, and I rush into the kitchen to make my root vegetable dish. But I cannot find my Dutch oven. I look and look and look, and I finally give up. I start chopping vegetables, very frustrated, and then at some point, I look around, and you just saw it. I could not see this thing, even though it's big and red, because, you see, it has a plant in it, and I don't put plants in the oven. So it didn't register. It did not register that that was my Dutch oven. And I'm saying that if we are holding a false frame, we literally can't see what's right next to us, including solutions that we can be part of that really work. And so that is what I mean by this idea that it's not seeing and believing, but for our species, it's believing is seeing. So what is the frame through which we see? And that's where my theory of population begins, because I believe that where we are because we are trapped in a downward spiral that I call a spiral of powerlessness. Remember, I started out saying solutions are known, but we feel powerless to manifest this. Where does that come from? I'm claiming that it comes from, and you're not going to be surprised at this word, a mindset of scarcity. Scarcity of goods and scarcity of goodness in us. There's not enough of anything. There's not enough food. Certainly that's our belief. You see, scarcity is the new norm. That's what Lester Brown says. But you could go on and on. You know, there's not enough energy. There's not enough parking places on top of campus. There's certainly not enough love in the world. Name it. And there's not enough of it. That's the scarcity view. And here's the problem with it, that it begins with this threesome that makes up the mind through which we see. One is that we're all separate from one another and from the earth, that the reality is static, stasis, and that scarcity is a given. I'm so proud of myself for getting it down to 3 S's, so that you for that. And so that mindset is, I'd say, the premise of not enough goodness in us, and the sense of separate from everything around us sets us up for this spiral of powerlessness that starts with distrust of self. If we distrust ourselves, we certainly can't trust our neighbor to come together in problem solving with us, what we generally think of as democracy. No, we can't do that. And so we've got to look for some automatic force that will sort it all out, because we are just too limited to figure it out ourselves. And we've been told by many, certainly Ronald Reagan called it the magic of the market, that if we turn over our fate to it, this is the spiral that we go around here, that things will sort out. The problem is the particular market that we've chosen to believe in is actually a one-rule market. It is driven by, primarily by a single driver, highest return to existing wealth. So wealth accrues to wealth, accrues to wealth, accrues to wealth, until we end up with inequality so great that, can you believe this estimate? This is a relatively new estimate that I just can't get my head around, that 80 people control as much wealth as half of the world's people. That degree of concentration of wealth, we end up with a country here that has greater inequality than India, Liberia, or Yemen. And so, what happens next? What happens is that concentrated power that infuses our political decision making. So we end up with what I like to call privately held government. Privately held government. And what does that mean? It means, for example, that there are now 24 lobbyists in Washington registered. There are probably a lot more who aren't, that are applying the interest of private interests for every person that you and I have elected to represent us there. And so we've been warned about this circumstance for many, many decades, but nobody said it better than Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1938. And he said, "The liberty of democracy is not safe if a people tolerate the growth of private power to the point that it is stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism." Now, I admit that I have not had the nerve yet to use the F word without quoting the president. But nonetheless, I think he really nailed it. And I just want to give you 3 examples of what privately held government means to me that we try to highlight through the midst of this book. Just 3 examples about the food system that are so obvious, and you know the basic outline. But none of us, you know, if we were actually had a voice, we would not choose to subsidize foods that are making us ill. And yet, something like 130, last estimate I heard, $134 billion over a decade going to subsidize commodity crops, mainly corn and soy, that then turn into the kinds of processed foods that end up creating the downward health cycle that I began with. And contrast that with about $4 billion going to so-called specialty crops, which are the things that are healthy for us. I see this so strongly also in the GMO phenomenon. I mean, I'll just say a couple of things about that. The fact that the GMO makers could infuse their view into our government and succeed in getting widespread use of something without any significant prior testing or public debate about whether we needed it at all. I've never met one single person who said, yes, I think we need, before GMO's propaganda began, came out and said, yes, this is what I want, genetically modified organisms. But I won't go into, in the time I have, I won't say a lot about GMOs, but just one study that we cite that I found particularly telling, that's very useful in conversations with people, that somebody did an overview of more than 100 studies done about GM safety in animal studies. And they found that of those that were linked to industry, not one single one found harm, evidence of any harm to the animal in the animals tested. However, nearly 1/4 of those who were independent of all corporate influence, 1/4 found some evidence of harm to the animals being tested. So that was very interesting to me, and of course, just the fact that 90% of us Americans say we want to have GMO label, and yet, and 54 other countries do, but we do not. So I'm just mentioning these as examples of what happens in privately held government. And of course, perhaps the biggest shock of all is what happened in 2007 and 8 with the commodity speculation as we withdrew government oversight that by one estimate, food commodity speculation increased 20-fold between 03 and 08, leading directly to increased hunger in the world as food prices shot up and people are already spending half of their incomes on food or desperate. So I'm just mentioning these as what is the hunger consequence of privately held government. So here we are, and I'm going to put this slide back up. The powerlessness, spiral powerlessness intensifies when the world moves this way. Then we say, see, I told you so, I told you so. Human beings really are these selfish little critters, and we really can't make democracy work. Look what's happening to us. And so this spiral of powerlessness intensifies. So here I am. And my other claim that the reason that this mindset of scarcity and the spiral of powerlessness that intensifies the roots of hunger, why that can't succeed, that mindset can't succeed, is that it denies 3 of our basic human needs beyond the physical. And this is a crisis, as we saw with dramatic numbers with the increased death rate among whites in America recently, that people were so alarmed with as we've seen this. But these 3 human needs that are not met in the scarcity mindset are our need for connection with one another in the earth, our need for meaning in our lives, and our need for power, that is effectiveness, agency, and sympathy. So it is no surprise then that, in fact, suicide is taking more lives in the world today than are all natural disasters and conflicts together. So this mindset, let's say, that is like the root of hunger and many other problems, also fails to meet our bigger needs. So the good news, however, the good news is that there is another way of seeing life. And I love to think of it as the 3 C's. And this is a way of seeing life that is arising across many disciplines. And it is much more, I believe, there is strong evidence, much more science-based. It is assumed that we are all connected to one another, that the nature of reality is continuous change, and therefore we are all co-creators of our reality. And this shift has enormous consequences, because this notion that we are in continuous change and co-creators is very consistent with, for example, Dennis Noble, physiologist at Oxford, wrote The Music of Life, and said that, of course, in biological systems, there are no privileged components telling the rest what to do. Rather, every component is shaping every other component moment to moment. And the late German physicist Peter Dorer said to me, Frankie, he said, in biological systems, there are no parts, there are only participants. So this notion of shifting to this connected worldview, this relational worldview, has profound implications. And I'm saying that we know, in a sense, where to start. We start from the assumption in this worldview that we are all shaped by our context, and that therefore we have given a clue that maybe we should look at what are the conditions shown throughout our social evolution, and when they've done experiments on humans, what are the conditions that bring out the best in us, and what are the conditions that bring out the worst in us. And then we know how to orient our activities to manifest that which can bring out the best. And so I just want to start with the worst. I think that it's pretty clear that we know that these three conditions, whether we're talking about bullies on the playground or genocide, that these, the first, concentrated power, often brings out the very worst in our species. We know that secrecy is not good for us. On Wall Street, before the meltdown, it was the slogan of these traders who were slicing and dicing these products to make them look like good investments. Their slogan was IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. They knew they'd be out of there with their millions before we caught on. So secrecy does not do good things for us. And the third condition I point to is that which is blaming, the blame game, constantly believing that no, it's the other, it's not me, which is the opposite of the connected worldview. So my thesis is that we can really move, that the greatest discovery perhaps of my lifetime is the reality of neuroplasticity. I love that word, that we can, that new thoughts, we really do create new synapses in our brains. And by new learning that we can actually change the way we see the world and align it more and more closely with what we know of our nature and wider nature. And that is the compass that keeps me going. And so I ask, can we move then from this scary frame of we've hit the limits of nature, there's not enough of anything, to a frame of alignment, that if we align with what we know about our own nature, and what we know about nature, that there is enough for all of us. And so that is really the key shift here that I'm suggesting is at the root of ending the creation of hunger. I want to say that very deliberately. It's not just ending hunger, it's ending the continuous creation of hunger. And so to do that, we have to look and accept, to break with the downward spiral, to move to a spiral of empowerment. We have to look at what are the known qualities that are in our species that we can count on. And I won't go into this in detail, but I can give you, there is evidence from research that in most of us, these are very strong dimensions of our species that we are considered by many to be the most social of all species, and that I love the fact that when they look at when we compete versus when we cooperate, when they look at our brains in MRI scans, they find that when we cooperate, it's so pleasant and it's similar to watching somebody eat chocolate. So this makes possible then a very, very different starting point, what I call a spiral of empowerment. That we start with this premise that we know what conditions bring out the best in us, work towards them. They are the opposite of the conditions that bring out the worst. And so this brings me to mention that my future work, and in some way all of my life's work, really since the 80s, has been trying to ask myself, what would it mean to put my life on this side of history, where I am helping to recognize that we're all shaped by our context. We can't just point at the bad guys. And what is the context shown to bring out the best in us? And I would say the continuum of dispersion of power, transparency in human relationships, and mutual accountability. If we're all connected, we're all implicated. And we can point, say, at those bankers who created that food speculation and blame them only. But we also have to say, where were we when those regulations were pulled back? So I'm not saying equal responsibility, but I'm saying mutual accountability is the key. And so I made this just to help me. I call that approach to life living democracy. Democracy not as something we inherited, but that's fixed and finished, done mainly by officials somewhere else, but it's an exciting living practice of everyday life, how we behave in the classroom, with our families at home, at work, etc., and helping to manifest those three conditions, bringing out the best in us. And so on this living democracy path, I do believe that food has a very powerful role to play, and it is the emergence of living democracy from the village level to national policy that is actually stopping the creation of hunger and realizing a reality where everyone has access to the food they need. So I will just make this bold claim that I think there are many pathways to talking about and to making it real for people the way that living democracy is emerging in the world. But I think food has a particular power because we have to make that decision multiple times a day of what we eat. So that connects us right there with others and the earth, that it connects us, of course, directly to our own body. And it gives us then those choices a sense of power. And it certainly has been extremely helpful in my life to recognize that I can tell the story to myself about living democracy best through what is happening in the world with solutions to hunger. So I want to take you quickly to Andhra Pradesh, India, where I was a couple of years ago, about 2.5 hours drive from Hyderabad. And I met with women there who, to me, they are manifesting living democracy. And what I mean by that is they told me a few decades ago, they kept using the word dark. My life was dark. So dark, they did not know that one day or the next that they could feed their children. They were humiliated by landlords, beaten by their husbands. They were so poor they had one sari to wear, and they couldn't even bathe properly because they could just take a piece of it and wash it and then move it around. They felt absolutely powerless. With a little bit of help from a revolving loan, they were able to come together to make decisions together, begin to discover the power of their sangam, they called it. Met once a week. They do meet still once a week at 9 o'clock at night. They decide together. They moved away from heavy reliance on white rice, a very low nutrition crop, and began to plant. I walked in their field with 20 crops in an acre or so. They learned enough about seeds. You can see the elder there making the seed selection for saving. They began to save seeds and then started a caravan they could take every year in February to dozens of other villages, teaching the art of seed saving and sharing. They developed a process of food security in their villages so that they would store extra food for those families who needed extra. And by the time I got there, I said, "Oh, show me more about your food security system." And they said, "Well, we don't do that anymore." And my heart sank, and they said, "We don't need to. Every family has food security. We don't need to do the village level food bank anymore." They have their own radio station now, and they share the lessons they are learning. And now in 75 villages, they have achieved absolute food security. And here is the mutual accountability part. You see their arms outstretched. This is the Deccan Development Society. You can look them up and read about them on their website. Their arms stretched out is their mutual commitment to one another, which they enforce. That everybody agrees, no chemical applications in their farming practices, no GMO, and everyone shares what they learn, and everyone shares their seeds. And when I left their villages, they said to me, through our sangam, the main thing that we learned was courage. What we learned was courage, and that changed everything. And now they are actually succeeding in convincing the state government to procure these much healthier millets. You know, I mentioned iron being such a devastating reality in so much of the Global South, that there is a type of millet that has, I believe, double the iron that rice has. And so they have succeeded in convincing the state government for their food security, their subsidized food distribution to procure the local production of these varieties of millets. And so that is one aspect of living democracy very directly, where people are coming together and finding the courage. Oh, one more thing about courage. When someone is abused in the village, when a woman is abused, the whole group goes to confront the spouse who committed the abuse. And so they found that kind of solidarity, of course, which gives them much more, I'm sure that ripples out everywhere in the villages. I want to jump quickly to Niger, another story we tell in the book, because of the scale of it. And, I just put this in because I just want to show you how proud and beautiful and beaming they are at their success there. It was just such a glorious time. So, but I want to take you to Niger because this is also, many of you may have heard this story, but in the 70s when people were confronted with drought, and many families were leaving this part of the world. That some stayed and said, "Wait, our ancestors knew how to do this," and they developed a whole range of ecological practices, including the nurturing of trees under the French rule. That they were worried about even touching the trees because they belonged to the colonial government, but they learned that they could nurture the regrowth of trees and mix them with agriculture to produce such increases in yield. It lowers the ground temperature and holds the soil in place, and on and on. And so you see this dramatic figure of 12.5 million acres, 200 million trees, and 2.5 million people. Food security has been secured through this reseeding process. And I just want to say about climate change that one of the studies we cite is a scientist in, I believe, the Netherlands estimated that if the entire EU turned to agroforestry, such as the mixing of trees and other ecological practices, that it would sequester, has a technical potential to sequester about 37% of greenhouse gas emissions from the EU. So this is another huge piece of the other thing that I wanted to talk about, however, was the state level, because I've been so struck. I know that now we are hearing, I also wanted to mention the rise of democratic economies. We tell stories about cooperatives in many parts of the world. This is an example of Africa, but about the largest dairy cooperative in India, for example. So cooperatives are not as marginal and irrelevant as they can sometimes feel in this country. In many parts of the world, they are powerful, and there are more people who are members of co-ops than own shares in publicly traded companies in our world. But I also want to move quickly to a national story. I know that there's a lot of trial and tribulation in Brazil today, a lot of problems emerging, but we should not throw out Brazil with the bathwater, if one might say, that there are still powerful, powerful lessons that are still holding about what a country can accomplish. And I want to underscore about zero hunger, which the program I'm sure you have heard of, that the reason that that came about beginning in 2003 with the election of Lula, President Lula, is because of citizen organizing that started in the 70s, 80s, and beyond, that focused not just on food, but nutritious food and right, and succeeded by 2010 in putting that right into the Constitution. And once Lula was elected and focused on the first working class president, focused on zero hunger as a goal, ignited programs all over the country. I got to visit one very large city, Belo Horizonte, which now about 3 million people, which has brought together advisory council of all different sectors of society to come up with a way to make the market work for everyone. As a person with city government said to me that if you're a poor person, you're still a citizen. So I'm the mayor, I'm still accountable to you. If you can't afford food in the market, I've got to make the market. And so that led to all sorts of innovations, really, really simple things like this, just allowing people to have a produce stand on the street corner, the city-owned land, but they made it so attractive that farmers were willing to come in to sell their great food as long as, and the only rule was they had to keep the price within the reach of poor people. And so that then has led to many, many programs in Belo Horizonte, has led to really, I think, one of them is this public restaurants, which my daughter and I got to visit, which is also a remarkable innovation because it doesn't have any stigma attached to it, unlike our food bank situation, food pantry situation. And so the achievement in this city was remarkable. that in 12 years, we're able to cut child mortality by 73% through the innovations that were part of Zero Hunger in Brazil. So I know that obviously some of you have to go, so I want to make sure that I jump through the end of this talk very quickly. I want to bring this home to the United States, that in fact we can learn from the women in Belo Horizonte, the people in India and Niger that I talked about, and step up ourselves as citizens. And I call it citizen-funded elections, which are succeeding in large measure in the state of Maine, just strengthened theirs in the last election. Deb Simpson, my superhero, who became a waitress in Auburn, Maine in the year 2000, and because of the election, citizen-funded elections, she was able to become a stellar legislator. A longer story, but I'll just leave her image there for a moment. And I also want to introduce you to an organization I'm just getting to know called Democracy Matters, young people who are coming together, paid internship program. I can tell you more about it, that are working toward getting money out of politics and our voices in. So these are some of the things that really lead me to these little hints of democracy emerging around the world and what we can do here. You see why I get up in the morning. And so I want to close with the final section, more personal section, about what internal shift we can make to be part of this extraordinary time of, on the one hand, and on the other hand, this time of choice. On the one hand, our food system is completely a dead end, and that hunger, if you include the nutritional deprivation, is massive. On the other hand, these solutions are emerging, both in industrial and in non-industrialized countries. And so what does that mean for us internally? And I summarize it under the label of bold humility. That's what I'm working with. That's what I'm working with. And what I mean by the bold part first is that, we're told that our problem, our species, were too individualistic. Well, I have come to believe the opposite. I believe we're so social that the hardest thing to do is when the tribe is heading over the falls to point the canoe the other way. To break with the pack is so hard because we're so wired to want to be accepted. And this is a moment in the history of our species that the dominant pack is heading, yes, to disaster. So it's a time that's called for its great courage. Then back to neuroplasticity again. We can change the synapses in our brains that make us feel powerless. How do we do that? We do it by changing our news diet, by not avoiding the bad news, of course, but constantly working to bring in stories of possibility into our daily lives, if not our weekly consciousness, and telling those stories and spreading them. So changing that sense of possibility. We also, if we take in this idea that we're all shaped by context and that we're all affected moment to moment by what context we're in, then a great way to become a living Democrat, small d, of course, is who we hang out with. I would say, what I'm constantly looking for, and fortunately I'm finding in many people, is people more courageous than I, who are risk takers. And I'm convinced that I become more of a risk taker as I choose those in my inner life. And so we can change ourselves in that way too. And also gimmicks help. Gimmicks help. Because I tell you, I had this moment where it was the Al Gore's debut of his slideshow thing. And I was in an audience with a bunch of my friends. And when he came in the room, I knew everybody was going to kind of do a collective bow. I mean, not literally, but emotionally. And I was really upset with Al that he wasn't bringing it back to money and politics and the absolute privately held government that's blocking us. And I was afraid. I was afraid to raise my hand because everybody in the aisle I was sitting on would have said, oh, you don't want to. He's so brave. So what happened? My heart started going, and usually I say, oh, you wimp. But in that moment I said, hey, Frankie, you're always telling people to reframe things. So reframe that. Is your inner applause And that inner applause gimmick has helped me over and over again. I did get my hand up, I'm bored enough. But nonetheless, I got my gimmick that does indeed work most of the time. And so in this bold humility, I found it also extremely helpful to have a lodestar I carry with me. And my lodestar is one Darn Mathai, who planted 7 trees on Earth Day in 1977. She was humiliated for her environmental work, building the Greenbelt movement. She was arrested and taken to jail, beaten, and she just kept walking, as she put it to me. When Gari passed away in 2011, but after Greenbelt movement had planted, when we got there, it was maybe 20 million trees, and the organization was a little shaky, and I was so worried. But what happened a few years later is that she won the Nobel Peace Prize. Then she joined up with the UN Environmental Program for Plants for the Planet, and you know how many Plants for the Planet? Last time I checked their website, it was 13 billion trees. And so when Gari, is the ultimate embodiment for me of this lesson, that it is really not possible to know what's possible once you live in this world of connectedness, continuous change, and co-creation. That somebody's 7 trees could, a few decades later, in effect, have helped to trigger the planting of 13 billion trees. And so I was thinking with her powerful faith as someone who embodies the boldness. And the humility part is precisely this, is to recognize that no matter how dark it can seem, that actually it's prideful, it's hubris to say we can determine what the outcome will be for us. In fact, I count all these things like Brazil, which I would have given the least chance of making the turn it has taken, or, what Gari's life, over and over again, that what I thought least likely to happen has actually happened. And this is the theme of it's not possible to know what's possible. So I'll close with just a few words that have hung on my wall since the 1970s, the Chinese writer. Hope cannot be said to exist, nor can it be said not to exist, for it is like the roads across the earth. In the beginning, there are no roads, but when many people pass one way, a road is made. So thank you for listening, and hope you have time for questions.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, so please speak up loudly. Frankie will call on you from there. That clock isn't working, so it's 25 minutes. If you were wondering, 25 to 5. Frankie, I'll let you call the people.
Hi. Thanks so much for your talk. I'm Lauren Smith. I'm a spectator here at Fletcher School. And I was just curious if I'm somewhat personal, but you were having all these thoughts and these big questions plaguing you, and I know a lot of people struggle with how to translate that kind of philosophizing, if you will, into action and livelihood, and managed to do that very successfully. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you were able to.
Thank you. Yeah, I was inspired by my parents, who were very courageous, and they modeled the idea that if we really cared enough about something, we could learn enough to make a difference. They weren't well known, but they modeled that, and it's only taken me now late in life to really appreciate that, so that I didn't have to question that. And so I have to say also, and this is what I want to help build for all of you young people, is that in my youth, when I was your age, it was a time that I felt like there was a movement that, like when I started out as a community organizer, and even though I was doing that work in the African-American neighborhoods in Philadelphia, I felt like I was linked to the women's movement and the anti-war movement and the environment. We felt like we were part of something historic. And so that gave me a whole lot more courage. And that's what I want for you all, and that's what I wanted to focus my life to help it to spur the sense that we are together part of history turn. So that's then I would say that I don't know really the answer except that I've always tried to ask the next question that has just so driven me all my life to, through the different stages of organizations I've been part of now. And I don't really know how to answer that except that the trust that if you care enough and keep asking the questions and seeking out, just trusting that you can find answers that will take you to the next question, that is this great blessing. I was just at a university Anyway, I was just mentioning to students that I made a D on my first English paper in college. And within 6 years, I've written Diet for a Small Planet. So, it's not possible, no one's possible. You think that something is not your calling, but you don't know. If you just keep following your curiosity, often people say, well, follow your passion, but I think that could be a little bit tempting if you don't have a passion. But we all have curiosity, and I guess, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that trusting that your curiosity will lead you to a life of meaning and power and connection, which is my trilogy of what I think we all need. And I really appreciate your question. Thank you. Yes, Ellen.
Yes. So, this is really wonderful, and I'm going to go back to a couple of historical questions and discussions. One is the issue of women. And, as you mentioned in response to the other question, that the women's movement was certainly part of this whole context that was evolving as you were developing your ideas. And what special aspects of women get involved in issues of food, care for the environment? How has that changed the context in which all of us try to produce action that is really the real definition of hope in terms of acting forward? So the women's question, particularly in relation to Wangari and the Deccan women, I would also think about the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee that started in 1971. So is there a very special role here for women, and particularly for third world women, providing models for other women? How are you looking at these? And this relates actually to my other question, which is, so much of what you present to us in terms of your framing and your language is what I associate with religious language, that the language from stasis to change to co-creation, from separation to connection. This is the language that I associate with religious language, and certainly I know among your early supporters carrying forward were certainly liberal groups across the U.S. So can you talk a little bit how that context has continued to change?
Let me answer on the second part first, in that I like to think of the living democracy worldview, the shift from a worldview of the three S's, the scarcity mind to the eco mind, as science-based and experience-based. And I think more of the religion, what I think of the religion is the belief that the core change we have to look at is the change in the human heart. And so I'm distinguishing my perspective, which of course I love changes for the good in the human heart, but I see that this focus on context and that we are all products of our conditioning, and we must therefore change the context if we want to address the roots of human suffering. That it's saying that if we don't know whether we're one of the good ones who will behave morally in our religious teachings. If we're say, there were a lot of good Germans, right? There were a lot of religious Germans during the Holocaust who succumbed and who didn't stand up. So I never want to be tested. And so I want to work toward creating the conditions so that none of us, that we are living in context where we're holding each other accountable and ensuring that change of the human heart isn't what it all depends on, that we can be working to create the conditions that actually keep in check the worst in us through transparency and mutual accountability. So I really distinguish my framing of it. It's not to in any way denigrate a religious orientation, but it's to say that my own passion is about this idea of bringing forth the conditions that bring forth the best, that have proven to bring forth the best in our species. So, so in a way, I'm hoping that that frame is something that many religions could actually identify with as part of the human responsibility, that would bring us together across the life. That's what I'm hoping. As far as women, certainly in my life, in this last decade or more that I've been back in with Hope Sedge and now with this book and writing about food, is the women who definitely have shown the leadership that I've just been so impressed with and inspired, and their focus on group decision making and sharing and decision making and holding each other accountable. I think that is something that a practice that certainly the men in these villages are learning from as women have taken leadership. So I think that I'm sure many of you studying what is inspiring you in the Global South, that it is the women in leadership is a very striking piece of it. And of course, as we move toward an aligned agriculture, aligned with regenerative laws of nature, what many call agroecology, that women are more that women benefit because it does not rely on credit, which they often don't have access to in so many parts of the world, and that it's really about learning and sharing these practices, not about who can get the credit to buy the input. So that removes one of the things that cut women out, I think, of agricultural leadership. And also it privileges, or not privileges, but it restores the longstanding in many communities. I assume in many parts of the world, certainly in India, where the women were the seed savers and honored for that deep knowledge. And then with the commercialization of seeds, that their roles were no longer really honored and passed on. So I think I'm just agreeing with what you were suggesting, and just on on this part, it may be somewhat different from your perspective on the religious part. But I appreciate the question very much, and I think and we can talk. Other questions? Yes, please.
And how the reality of like teachers so the problem solved. The first religious to education and change that.
Well, it is. I would say yes. It's power distribution that is and I think it starts with our understanding of what is power. That power is not simply guns and money. That power is what the women in economic development doing. And this comes back to the end of my talk, that one very direct way is to shift this mindset that you can't even see women like this. Is this? It sounds simple, but sharing a story of possibility is a revolutionary act. That letting people know that this is actually working in many parts of the world, and the kind of courage that farmers and rural people are showing, trying to stand up against land grabs. Tim's work is documenting in a number of places in the world, and so to remove the myths that justify. One of the big myths out there is that rural people would all move to the city if they could, and so the more that you can learn and tell the more accurate story of possibility, and including, of course, the utter dead end of our industrial food system, it just cannot. It is collapsing. Whether we're talking, I can begin to get into it. We're talking about groundwater, soil, or nutrient cycle disruption, and so I think the big thing is that people don't see another way, and that's the big obstacle. And so therefore, they can't. There's no containers, there's no mental. So anything you can do to start awakening yourself to a different way of seeing possibility, and making sort of common sense points about how our current path is not working. working. I mean, it's very confusing, isn't it, when you hear from the news sources that, oh, we've cut hunger by almost half, the share of hungry people by almost half since 1990. Yay, 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 our development model is working. That's very confusing for people. And then on the surface, you know, you can't say they're lying with those numbers, but it's just so far from the complete story of disempowerment. So anything that you can do to be a courageous truth teller, and we all are educators, you know, we all influence our friends, our families. There's so many opportunities to spread stories about what the reality is and how do we model that. So I just couldn't underscore, and also in our own country, one of the great exciting moments for me, having lived this long now, is to see that for the first time that conservatives and liberals are expressing the same outrage, a very similar kind of outrage and concentration of wealth and its takeover on our political system. It's the first time there's been that kind of unity. So in my lifetime, so, you know, what does that foretell? That seems to me that again, it's not possible to know what's possible. Once we see that, you know, somebody told me 20 years ago when I was living in Vermont that Bernie Sanders would be actually taken seriously and have, what was it, how many thousand, 20,000 people in downtown Boston or something. So I just, it's more that frame of mind I'm asking you to entertain. And then you'll see possibilities, I'm convinced, for how you can engage with it. Maybe it's learning about this Democracy Matters, this college organization that offers paid internships, and even if that's not for you, that you could share that news with others and be inspired by it. Having a summit at Colgate. Yes, Rachel.
Are you guys sponsoring something for the This Changes Everything screening? Because it's not part of the This Changes Everything project.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Talk about, so
Thank you.
the book talking about all these problems that we're dealing with, which can, I think, really get people down, and then they've made it into a situation where people can share stories that could be used in other places, and I think that's a good.
Yeah. Do you want to? When is that happening?
I don't know. I actually don't know.
Yeah, we're co-sponsored. We just signed on, but I don't know what it is. But I bet if you just Google "This Changes Everything" in Boston, and it's an event coming up soon.
And I think there's a screening at Fletcher. Is that right? Somebody's showing it at Fletcher. The This Changes Everything document. Okay, well, I could be wrong, but it is being screened.
And if you have trouble, just email us at info@smallplanet.org. And we have the email that is coming. So thank you, Rachel. Yes.
My name's Eve. I work with a nonprofit organization called Gardens for Health and Nutritional, and we work with the families of malnourished children to integrate nutrition-sensitive agriculture into the treatment of malnutrition at the household level. And I've been doing this work for a few years, and I'm totally new to it, other than the work I've done with Gardens for Health. And to me, it seems like we're doing this work at a really exciting time. A lot of these movements and ideas about enriching the earth in order to nourish children and the next generation and humans and communities has a lot of momentum right now, and we're kind of on the verge of something exciting. And I was just wondering, in your experience, since you started asking these questions, if you've seen us cycle through some spirals of scarcity, spirals of empowerment, if you feel like we're on the verge of a spiral of empowerment, or kind of how you've seen these movements coming together or falling apart, like through your career.
Well, actually, the what we now think of the food movement really only, in my experience, really started to come together, you know, really in the 90s and the 2000s. I mean, it's mainly in the 2000s, actually. I mean, so it's still, I'm just amazed at the growth of and all the connections made among actors in the food movement. And so that's very, very helpful. And, you know, I think about, you know, what CSA started in the 80s in Western Massachusetts, and, you know, just keep increasing community support agriculture, and just keep increasing. But the 80s may seem like a really long time ago to you, but still, you know, that nobody really heard about, probably. 15 years ago or so, and really started to, so, and community gardens and all of the dimensions. So I see it very hopeful, expansion, and that's true of a number of other movements. And so now my question is, how do we consciously make ourselves part of an anti-movement? And there's an organization called the Democracy Initiative, which is bringing together a range of groups from Greenpeace to unions to the NAACP, and that to really help connect people and see that no matter what issue we're working on, that we are united in working for a real democracy. And so that's the exciting thing to me, that that's happening really not for the first time. Not only are there more powerful movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter, or the Air Club's incredible victories over coal plants, etc. But there's this consciousness that there has to be a meta movement as well, a real democracy movement. So that's what gives me the excitement. Thank you.
One last question.
Okay, I think you've made it very clear that at a global level, there is no scarcity. I was wondering if that also holds for the local level, and if you therefore think that increased production in an agroecological way should not be part of the shift towards improvement.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that certainly in many localities that there is not enough because that people don't have the tools and the land, the people who really need to grow, want to grow, like the people I met in Pradesh, who were dependent on, very low nutrition, subsidized white rice. I mean, there's a great need for increased production of, diverse grains and legumes and oilseeds and all of that. So there's really so much. Well, the shift is, of course, not just to greater quantities, but the kind of qualities that I saw in Andhra Pradesh in those fields, and so and not to be so fixated on the maximum quantities, but to be fixated on the overall increase in nutrition that is available to people. So I think it's a very different way of thinking about what is the purpose of agriculture, and that it is, in so many parts of the world, there's so much potential that is not tapped because people don't have the knowledge and tools to relate to the land in a healthy way. But that can be shared. And so, for example, in the Andhra Pradesh story, that the state government, an arm of the state government, is actually using stipends to what it calls village activists and cluster activists. These are the people who are training in agroecological techniques, village to village, and so it's so they shift away from how do we grow the most to what works for our health, and yes, of course, productivity is a factor, but it's only one factor. So I hope that answers your question, but I really see that shift in these and many others.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you here. And now, do we have to leave this room by 5? No.
I thought so. I'm not familiar now.
Okay, we'll find out. But in the meantime, there are books for sale, I believe. What are they going for? $18. They came out, thanks to Small Planet Institute, came out in paperback simultaneously with hardback, so they're available to you now at this low price. So anyway, the bookstore is here to sell them to you, and I'm sure Frankie would be happy to sign them for you. And thank you again for coming, Frankie. And thank you also.
There is a screening on this campus on Friday the 13th from 6 to 9 of this music thing. I haven't seen it, but I think that is the goal of which part of this? I don't know. I'm not usually on the downtown campus. I think it's in the Olin. Does that sound like? Sorry, I don't. Olin 12. I think 6 to 9 on Friday.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah.
Well, for, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure people can read about it. I mean,